Hello, this is Jason, and a new story on my author's channel.
A veteran sniper unit, Jake stood on the roof of an abandoned building in the center of town when he looked through his scope. He was alone, but he could feel someone watching him. The rain slid lightly across his tactical goggles, but it didn't bother him. He had stood in similar positions many times in his life, knowing that every move he made was a matter of life and death. He was in his element. At that moment his gaze froze, and for a second the world around him ceased to exist. From under the bulky concrete structures, through a crack in the wall, he noticed a silhouette. Far away, almost at the limit of visibility, she stood holding a rifle. A young woman, with long hair, with a short stride. It can't be, he thought. His experience told him that the likelihood of her firing was minimal. Her hands didn't seem to be trained to hold a gun so confidently. She didn't have that ironclad confidence that showed in the eyes of those who had been through years of training and combat missions. She didn't look like a sniper. This would be stupid, he reasoned. He checked the shot. No one. He gave himself time to think, but still continued to watch her movement. As always, at such moments, he predicted the outcome. It would all be over in a few minutes, her senseless attempt and his unerring expectation. She ignored him. She just stood there, waiting. Then, as if on cue, her hands suddenly stiffened in one position, and she fired. Jake, without blinking, took her movement into frame. When the scope captured the target, he froze for a moment. He didn't realize it at first, but the shot had hit its target, more than a mile away. A moving target. Impossible, he said, but his voice was too quiet for anyone to hear. As Jake descended from the roof, his steps were measured, as if he saw nothing strange in what had happened. His squad mates did not notice the change in his demeanor, and he said nothing. The word impossible hung in the air, but with each step it became more and more commonplace. He was a sniper, and in his world there was no room for doubt. He knew his mission, knew that what was happening was normal, that nothing was outside the realm of his experience. There was no room in his head for explanations. The training he had gone through was more than just a formality. It was life, conditioned to the point of automatism. Every shot, every calculation, every weather analysis, it was all part of who he was. But that shot, that was different. He went home, to his daily duties, and continued doing what he had always done, until his team heard about a girl named Catherine. Catherine came to them literally on cue. Her request to participate in training was not an exception, but what she demonstrated when she first showed up left many doubting. They all thought she was just an ambitious newbie who wanted to prove something to herself and the world. But her look, her posture, the way she held her weapon, made it immediately clear that she was not like everyone else. She was not an ordinary newbie, and she was not even a real girl among snipers. She was something more, something they could not yet comprehend. At the training camp, her approach was strange, even unnatural. At first glance, Catherine seemed awkward, her movements were blurry, her actions were uncertain. But her uncertainty concealed an unimaginable precision. She did not try to follow accepted standards, did not look for convenient solutions. She went her own way. Her first attempts at shooting, at range, at accuracy, were not impressive. Each of her shots was like a template, with predictable mistakes and deviations. Everyone thought that she was not up to the task, that she did not have what it took to be a sniper: composure, analysis, accuracy. However, everyone except Jake began to notice something strange. Her mistakes became less and less noticeable, and the process of shooting itself became not just accurate, but somehow perfect in its own way. She did not drive herself, did not try to be better than everyone else, she just did it. At one point, during one of the tests, she fired at a moving target over 2 kilometers away in front of the entire team. In an instant, the target was hit. She stood there, showing no emotion or surprise. Her eyes didn't show what Jake was used to seeing in the eyes of those who had just won. There was no sense of victory. The training continued, and each day her progress became more astonishing, but her behavior became more bizarre. She stopped talking. She stopped answering questions. She just was. Her gaze never moved from the scope, as if she were part of something larger that she couldn't understand. But Jake couldn't forget that shot. He replayed it over and over in his head. The calculations he'd been trained in didn't account for such possibilities. This wasn't just a fluke, it was more than that. He couldn't explain it, and it was starting to bother him. He was a professional. He knew what was supposed to happen to moving targets. He knew the limits of human precision and physical ability. And while it wasn't impossible, it certainly didn't fit into his understanding of the world. When they met again, after weeks of training, Jake couldn't contain his thoughts. "You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" he asked her, but his voice was cold, not accusing, more confused, as if he were trying to find out if he was wrong. He didn't wait for an answer. And Catherine didn't answer. She simply turned to him, and her eyes were as empty as ever. She didn't laugh, didn't smile, didn't show joy or sorrow. She just stared. "You don't understand what I'm trying to understand," she said quietly, but she didn't seem to be talking to Jake at all. And perhaps she really didn't expect anyone to understand. At one point, as they both stood there in silence, Jake felt everything around them begin to fade, as if reality itself was blurring, losing its clarity. It was only a moment, but it was enough to make him feel out of time. Questioning the reality of what was happening, Jake suddenly realized that there was nothing human in her gaze, only emptiness. And that frightening feeling that everything that was happening was just a consequence of something much bigger than they could understand. It was several days before Jake was able to meet Catherine again, and this time the meeting was much less formal. The time between training sessions passed quickly, but as always, the feeling of detachment from reality only grew with each passing day. He was no longer sure what was going on around him, and each training session she did made him question not only her abilities, but himself as well. A mission to an empty part of the state, to a remote training center, made no sense. They were supposed to be back at headquarters, preparing for new missions. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Catherine was more than just part of some program, something more important. And her shots that seemed impossible, were becoming more than just a matter of professional interest to him. They were a challenge, a tantalizing reminder that the reality he lived in wasn't so permanent. Her superiors continued to marvel at her success. They watched her with interest, but no one could explain what exactly she was doing, why her precision was so exceptional, her composure so uncertain. Catherine was not trying to succeed for the sake of recognition. That was obvious. She did what she did as if her mission were part of some larger process that none of them could even guess at. During another training session, Jake was forced to admit that something was wrong. He lay behind cover and watched her fire. There was something mesmerizing about her posture. She stood unwaveringly, and her hands, though they seemed less strong, less experienced, moved with a precision that could not be accidental. It was the moment when Jake realized that her abilities were beyond the scope of normal explanation. She doesn't do it like everyone else, he thought, looking at her figure through the scope. The moment she fired at the moving target, Jake no longer doubted that this could not be the result of simple training. This was something more. But what? His consciousness, increasingly absorbed by this thought, began to slow down. He mentally reviewed the details of what had happened before they both ended up in this place. How was it that she had mastered such complex skills so quickly? Why hadn't she talked about her life before she came here? All her answers to questions were short, emotionless, and not always even logical. All of this was throwing Jake's world into disarray. He knew better than to trust his gut instincts when it came to military operations. But with each passing day, he began to sense more and more that there was more going on than just training. He began to feel like he was missing pieces of the puzzle, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever find them. The next morning, just as darkness was beginning to set in, Jake was out with Catherine again. They were heading for the same wooded area where the range tests had been conducted. Their task was simple. He was to monitor her shots. But each shot she fired was like a rupture, as if reality were breaking on the spot. He began to suspect that she could anticipate his actions, even if she wasn't aware of all his decisions, as if she already knew what was coming next. "Are you ready?" he asked, trying to hide his anxiety. Catherine only nodded. There was nothing unusual in her answers. She was always quiet, but today her silence was somehow deeper. There was no longer the anxiety in her eyes that had been there at the beginning. Everything was calm, as if she had become a part of this world, a part of something more important. Or, on the contrary, she had already ceased to be a part of this world. He adjusted his sights. The target was far away, kilometers away, far beyond the range of visibility. He fired first. The target barely moved. "Now you," Jake said, taking his finger off the trigger. Catherine stood beside him, taking her time, and shouldered the rifle. She didn't look in his direction as usual. She stared at the target, as if searching for something in that empty field. Jake felt time stretch, something change in the air. She wasn't in a hurry this time. She just stood there, as if waiting for something. When she fired, Jake didn't immediately understand what had happened. Only a few moments later did he see that the target had been hit. More than a kilometer away, on a moving target. Unusual precision. Her result was almost impossible. Jake knew it couldn't be. He wondered, not for the first time. What if this was all just an experiment? What if she wasn't just a sniper? He looked around, but there was no one to watch this. His eyes still couldn't believe what had just happened. And yet, despite his doubts, he saw that she had once again done what he thought was impossible. He was beginning to understand that her abilities weren't just the result of training, and something about this world was beginning to raise questions he didn't know how to ask. As they returned to camp, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the shot. Everything he thought was obvious now made no sense. He knew he had to figure this out, but it was all just getting more confusing. He just didn't know what was going to happen next, but he had this feeling that he was on the edge of something unknown. Jake couldn't forget that moment. The target a mile away, the target in motion, and that unexpected result. Without a doubt, the shot was accurate. But there was something more that bothered him, that gave him no peace. This could not be a simple coincidence. Pieces of a picture began to form in his mind that did not fit together. Every shot Catherine took seemed impossible, but her composure and cold precision remained unwavering. With each practice, her movements became more deliberate, even predictable. She made no mistakes. What if all her mistakes were part of a plan all along? What if she purposefully timed her shots perfectly, relying not on chance, but on a single hidden pattern? When they returned to camp, Jake couldn't break out of the loop. He knew he needed to report to command. He needed to verify the data, but those actions now seemed futile no matter how much he put them off. That shot at a moving target had been more than just skill. It had been a prediction. And here, among the remote training centers, at an altitude they couldn't even accurately describe, Jake began asking himself questions that had no easy answers. Questions about time, about what happens when you can't figure out where you are or where you've been. Questions about how things like this girl could be at the forefront of something he couldn't understand. What if Catherine wasn't new at all? What if she was part of some other process, his own, or perhaps a process that existed in a parallel reality where his actions were of a different nature? With each day he spent with her, these thoughts became more solid, more real. And, most frighteningly, his own perception of what was happening was changing. At first it was a subtle sensation, as if the picture in his mind was blurring. But with each new shot from Catherine it became clearer. This reality was unreliable. Jake was often alone, away from the others, trying to figure out what was wrong. He studied her movements, looking for clues in her behavior that might explain her accuracy. But every time he thought he had it figured out, that he understood, her next shot would shatter those guesses. What if she wasn't doing this of her own free will? What if her actions were part of some larger process that they all didn't know about? And then, one night, when everything around was covered in thick fog, he met her again. They were standing in the clearing where they had reported on the task a few minutes ago. The place was empty, covered with wet grass, but the air was strangely heavy, as if the whole world was waiting for something that could not happen. "Are you ready yet?" Jake asked, trying to hide the worry in his voice. He didn't know if he was ready to understand anything. He didn't know if he was ready to see her shoot again. Catherine nodded silently. She picked up the rifle, held it to her shoulder, and waited. She said nothing, showed no emotion. It was like watching a machine, operating according to a preset program. But it wasn't a machine. It was her. And now Jake knew he couldn't quite trust what he was seeing. Everything that was happening felt strange, as if he were in another dimension. When she fired, Jake felt his heart stop. At first, there was no sign that the target had been hit. He didn't even see movement. It wasn't until he checked the results on the screen that he realized the target had been killed. At a range of over 2 kilometers. Its accuracy was becoming impossible. He was silent. He couldn't say a word. Suddenly he felt something was wrong. It wouldn't leave him. He began to feel like he couldn't trust his perceptions. Time seemed to move in a new way, with subtle paradoxes. Thoughts began to swirl in his head that this couldn't be related to her training. This wasn't just precision. It was something more. But at that moment, when everything seemed simply impossible, he caught her gaze. Catherine looked at him, and there was no surprise or pride in her eyes. It was a strange silence, in which there was no emotion, but there was a confidence that defied explanation. Her gaze was, as if she knew what he would do next. "You know what's going on, don't you?" Jake said, trying to hide his nervousness. He hadn't expected an answer, but her silence seemed increasingly ominous. She said nothing, only took a step forward and prepared to fire again. And there was no unnecessary tension or haste in her movements. It was as if she knew that her actions had already been predicted. Jake froze. He saw her hand move back into position. He couldn't understand what she was doing, didn't know what it meant, but he was sure her shot would be accurate again. But it was at that moment that he realized there was no meaning to her actions. They weren't part of something he could predict. Catherine wasn't making mistakes. She was doing something that couldn't be explained. In that moment, in the deep silence, Jake realized that they were all part of something that was beginning to transcend their perception, and he wasn't prepared for what it all meant. Jake became more and more distant with each passing day. His thoughts, whenever he tried to focus on training or analyzing, kept returning to Catherine, her shots, her silence. He began to notice how the world around him was beginning to distort, as if everything that was happening, this camp, the training process itself, was just part of some mechanism beyond their comprehension. He tried to push the thoughts away, but the more he tried to ignore them, the more they became engulfing. Every morning, he woke up feeling like he had lost a part of himself, like something important was missing from his life. He felt like time was starting to lose its stability. He knew he should just keep doing his job, doing his assignment, but with each passing day his world became more and more distorted. One evening, returning from yet another training session, he suddenly realized that he could not remember exactly how he had come here. He knew that he and Catherine had left for training that same day, but what had happened before that? What had happened in the morning? And why did he feel so keenly that the time that had passed was not as he remembered it? It seemed as if everything happened in some kind of cycle. He could not remember a single event that he had experienced the day before. It seemed as if he had just been at his post, but at the same time everything was somehow strange. At that moment, Jake noticed that his days were beginning to blur together, with no clear beginning or end. Tasks became abstract. Questions became strange. And despite these growing doubts, he continued to do his job as if he had no choice. Catherine, as always, was part of this world, part of something that might be so much more than anything he had ever known. One evening, as the camp was consumed by silence, Jake stood at the window of his modest barracks, watching the empty sky. He expected the sounds of the night to fade away as usual, followed by complete peace. But instead, as darkness fell over the camp, he felt the air turn cold, and the camp itself fill with an unusual sense of menace. The night sky was not only cloudless, it seemed to hang over them like some invisible threat, and the stars seemed too bright, as if they were deliberately watching his movements. Something about the silence seemed strange. It wasn't just silence. It was like a gap, a voided space itself. He didn't understand why these thoughts were bothering him, but the feeling was so strong that he couldn't help but glance at his desk. There, among the papers, was an old report that he had never read. Jake remembered finding it a few days ago and putting it in the corner of his desk without much explanation. For some reason, he hadn't been interested in it before, but now his attention was drawn. He took out the paper and unfolded it. The report described unusual cases in different parts of the country where the military observed strange anomalies in the behavior of personnel. The process was postponed indefinitely, but the essence was one. The participants in this experiment suddenly began to demonstrate results that did not fit into scientific and physical norms. In most cases, they could not be explained. However, the data showed that some individuals who had nothing to do with sniper training suddenly became outstanding marksmen, and their behavior began to raise doubts about reality. One of the records mentioned a certain name, Catherine D. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. He had seen that name before, but how? He couldn't remember. He knew it couldn't be a coincidence. It was all starting to fit, but the answer was elusive. He read on, and as much as he tried to resist, his mind began to spin more questions. All these oddities, all these details that didn't add up. What if they were all part of the same picture? What if Catherine wasn't just a new cadet, but someone who'd been through something far more unusual? What if she was part of an experiment that none of them could fully understand? Anxiety began to rise within him, and with it a sense that the reality that surrounded him might be faked. He knew he had to talk to someone in charge, but he felt that something bad would happen if he did. What if he himself suffered the same fate as the other participants in the experiment? His heart sank. There was no answer. Only fragments of thoughts swirled in his head. He was ready to give up everything and break out of this camp, but the knowledge of Catherine continued to pull him like a magnet. He could not tear himself away from this feeling, from that elusive reality that was pulling him towards itself. And so, one evening, when the camp was once again swallowed by silence, Jake could stand it no longer. He decided to talk to Catherine. He had to find out what she was really hiding, if anything. He decided to approach her and ask her directly. He found her at the weight room. She was sitting on a bench, leaning her elbows on her rifle, staring into space. There was none of the fear in her eyes that Jake had felt. She was completely calm, as if her life had already been predicted. It was both calming and frightening. He walked up to her and said, barely containing his nervousness, "Catherine, what do you know? Why is all this happening?" She turned her head and looked at him. She didn't answer right away. Instead, her gaze, as if examining him, did something to the space around him. Jake felt time stretch, and suddenly, in that moment, he understood this woman, this figure standing before him, was not part of the world he lived in. And maybe that understanding didn't matter anymore. But her answer came so unexpectedly that he did not have time to prepare. "You're not asking what you need to know." Catherine's answer hung in the air, and Jake felt his mind begin to slip from clear perception. He couldn't put his finger on what it was about her words that had silenced him, but there was something about her tone that was literally creeping into his consciousness. He didn't know whether to continue this conversation or just walk away, but his legs couldn't move. He stood in front of her, and he couldn't shake the feeling that all her words were just pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. "You're not asking what you need to know?" she repeated, and her eyes were all over the place again. It wasn't a look directed at him. It was a look that saw something else entirely, something beyond the present that Jake couldn't comprehend. "What do you mean?" He breathed, trying to regain control of the situation, but her calm was almost hypnotic. Time seemed to slow down, and the world around him was disappearing. He felt himself becoming part of this strange space where there were no answers, no solutions. Catherine put down her rifle and stood up. Her movements were soft and confident, as if she were following a pre-rehearsed program, but her eyes were still empty, as if they were hiding some far more complex reality. "You're looking for answers you're not meant to know," she said finally, her voice oddly even distant. "But this isn't your time. You're not ready yet." He felt a wave of anxiety rise up inside him. He knew she wasn't just saying this. He realized that her words meant more than anything that had happened up until this point. And yet, he was sure that this was only the beginning. If he had known where this conversation would lead, maybe he would have chosen a different path. But now that he was here, he couldn't turn back. "You know what's going on here," he said, but there was no longer any certainty in his voice. He wasn't trying to get anything specific out of her. He just wanted to understand. To understand what was behind her demeanor, her absolute confidence, the way she seemed to be part of something much bigger than they could possibly imagine. She looked up, and Jake felt the emptiness in her eyes again, but this time it was different. The emptiness in her eyes was becoming something meaningful, not just an absence, but some kind of living space, ready to absorb everything that was left in him. "You started too late." Her voice sounded as if it was far away, as if her words were an echo that bounced off the walls in another dimension. "You're already inside, and maybe you don't even realize how close you are to the answer." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. The words didn't make sense in the context of their conversation, and everything that was happening seemed like some elusive plot that was unfolding right before his eyes. He felt again that strange chill that had washed over him the moment he first realized that this world was not as simple as he thought. "You don't have to look for answers," Catherine continued, her eyes now full of something inhuman, as if she were watching him through a prism of time. "You have to accept that everything has already been decided, and you are part of that decision." Jake swallowed. Nothing she was saying made sense to him. He was a military man. He knew that such talk was either manipulation or psychosis. But with her, it was different. It was a feeling that wouldn't go away. He couldn't believe that this was all just a mistake. No, he knew there was a truth here, hidden from them, and it was much deeper than he could have imagined. "I don't understand," he said, his voice shaking with bewilderment. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" She walked toward him silently, her steps like slashes in the silence, cutting through the air, leaving marks behind them. Jake felt his chest tighten, his breathing become heavy, his blood boil in his veins. He couldn't understand why, but in her presence the world began to seem unnaturally real and at the same time shaky. He was sure that if he took a step forward, his perception would change. And the thought scared him. Catherine stopped right in front of him. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was directed somewhere into space, beyond his understanding. And at that moment, Jake suddenly realized that her gaze was not directed at him, but at something behind him. He turned, but saw nothing. Then she spoke again, and her voice was now almost a whisper. "We are all observers. And your gaze is just what holds you back. It is not you who sees the world, it is the world who sees you. You will not understand until you realize that reality is not as you know it. You have already walked this path, and now you are beginning to forget. Everything you were looking for is already here, just not in the form you expected." Every word she said seemed to tear apart his usual perception. Jake felt his mind refusing to accept what she was saying. He knew it couldn't be true, that the world around them was not just something bigger, but something completely alien, capable of changing everything they knew. He opened his mouth to answer, but at that moment Catherine stepped back, and everything became blurry again. There was something in her movements that went beyond anything Jake had ever seen. She turned silently and walked towards the forest. As her figure disappeared into the darkness, Jake stood there, paralyzed. Only her words were spinning in his head, and every time he tried to comprehend them, everything became even more unclear. Maybe Catherine was right. Maybe he was already part of something else, something he couldn't explain, couldn't control. Or maybe he really wasn't there. When everything became quiet again, Jake realized he couldn't stay here any longer. Everything he knew about reality was now in question, but he didn't know where to go or what to do. Jake woke up in the dim light of morning, as always, feeling empty, as if he had left his soul somewhere without realizing it. He rose from his bed, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that had been plaguing him for the past few days. Every morning was the same, waking up in this camp, going through the same routine over and over again, with no meaning left. But today was different. Today his body felt more than just tired. It felt as if it remembered something that should not be forgotten. He glanced at the window, through which the outlines of trees had recently been visible. Now they were gone. Instead of the usual forest, a boundless wasteland stretched out before him. His breath caught, and he began to frantically look around, trying to understand how this was possible. Where was the forest? Why had it disappeared? These thoughts, like an avalanche, began to rapidly gain momentum in his mind. In his memory, as if in slow motion, scenes emerged. The evening when he spoke with Catherine, her gaze that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality, her words that left no room for doubt. Jake closed his eyes again, but instead of the foggy picture of dreams, scenes appeared before him that he could not explain. He stood up abruptly from the bed and headed for the door. He didn't know why, but this feeling of inadequacy became unbearable. He knew that he couldn't stay in this room, that he needed to see something more, to understand what was happening to him. Opening the door, Jake found himself in an empty hallway that seemed unusually long. Each of his steps was an echo, and the echo grew louder, as if the walls, floor, and air around him were beginning to narrow, trapping him in this endless tunnel. Suddenly his gaze fell on the clock on the wall. He froze. The time was not what he expected. The clock showed the same moment he had woken up at, without any change, as if the clock had become stuck in that single moment. Time was fixed, frozen, as if it refused to move forward. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, and his breathing became heavy. What's going on? He thought. It wasn't just a sense of time being out of whack. It was a sense that time itself had become an illusion, shaken by some hidden mechanism he couldn't understand. He walked down the corridor, his steps becoming more distinct and faster. He tried to remember what had happened up to this point, but his memory was like a black hole, absorbing everything that was connected to this camp. He could not separate one thought from another. Every moment, every day merged into this shaky chaos. He stepped outside. The familiar hangar stood before him, but it looked different now. There was no noise, no movement. Empty buildings, sometimes with half-broken walls, as if someone had abandoned them in the middle of a ruined world. Jake stepped forward, trying to find some landmarks. A vague memory of seeing the same place over and over again appeared in his mind, as if he had never left it. His gaze was drawn to a figure standing at the edge of the field. It was Catherine. She stood as if her figure had been carved out of thin air, like something alien to this world. She did not turn her head, but Jake felt her presence, as if she knew he was seeking her gaze. "You're here again," she said without turning around. Her voice was light, almost imperceptible, but it was felt in every cell of his body. Jake tried to approach her, but her steps did not move, as if he was rooted to the spot. He felt his mind losing control, his body no longer responding to his commands. It was all like a nightmare, where reality was creeping away, and his consciousness could not keep up with the changes. "What's happening to me?" he asked, trying not to sound confused, but inside he was screaming. Catherine turned her head silently, and her eyes met his. They were strangely calm, as if she knew everything but had no intention of sharing that knowledge. She approached him, step by step, and his world changed again. Everything around him began to pulse, as if space had become liquid and transparent. "You know what's happening, Jake," she said, her voice echoing in the void. "You created this reality, and you will destroy it." Her words shook him. He felt his thoughts begin to tangle, as if they were dissolving in this strange space. He tried to hold on to what was still familiar, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. "You can't escape it," she continued, her face blurring like smeared paint, as if her image was not anchored in this world. At that moment, Jake felt himself losing contact with reality. He didn't know if it was just a hallucination or if reality was actually beginning to change, but he knew one thing. Something huge, unimaginable, was happening to him, and perhaps to the world around him. Everything he knew was crumbling, and behind this destruction was something much deeper and inexplicable. "You have to figure out what happened," Catherine said, her figure now almost invisible, like a blurry shadow. "The answer is inside you, but you can't see it." Jake felt her presence fade, her words beginning to dissolve into thin air. Everything around him began to fade away, the world, the camp, reality itself. All that remained was his body and his mind, which began to feel like it was no longer in control. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself in the same empty hallway where he had started. Everything was the same as before. Everything was frozen in this timeless space. But now Jake knew that he would not be able to find a way out of this circle. He was trapped, a trap of his own making. Jake found himself back in that hallway, where every step echoed in the void. It was a place that had no beginning or end, as if his consciousness had locked reality itself into an impossible loop. He didn't know how he got here, didn't know how much time had passed since his last step had been his last. But he was sure of one thing. He had long since lost any chance of leaving. And something inside him, like a black abyss, was swallowing up the last spark of hope. He walked, not understanding why, not hoping for answers. Everything around him seemed alien and insignificant. His gaze was again drawn to the clock, the same one that stood frozen in a motionless moment of time. He approached it, not daring to touch it, as if any attempt to interfere with its strange flow could finally upset the balance. Suddenly, as if reality itself wanted to contradict his doubts, time began to move. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but with each passing moment, it became faster. Jake felt his heart begin to beat in time with the clock, his body began to feel gravity again, and the air became thicker, more real. He flinched when he saw her. Catherine stood at the end of the hallway, motionless. Her figure was still as a stone statue, but her eyes were full of emptiness and at the same time something terrible and inevitable. She did not say a word, but her gaze spoke volumes. It was not just expectation. It was an invitation, ominous and invisible, like a shadow that foreshadows an inevitable meeting. He approached without realizing what he was doing. It was as if his legs were moving on their own, without any will. The quality of his movements became strange. They were slow and heavy, as if he were underwater. With each step, his senses became more acute and at the same time distorted, as if he was becoming more and more separated from what he considered reality with each passing moment. "You're here again," Catherine said, her voice clear but also floating in the air like smoke. He couldn't figure out what it was about her words that made him feel this way, as if they were spoken by someone who had long forgotten what it was like to be alive. "How do you do that?" Jake breathed. He wasn't asking, he was just saying it because he couldn't think of any other way to express his confusion. Catherine took a step toward him. Her movements were fluid, like those of someone who had long ago learned to be part of this strange world where physics made no sense and time did not obey the usual laws. She came very close, and he smelled her, something unusual, as if the air around her was filled with steel and electricity. There was nothing human in her eyes. "You ask how, not why," she said, but her words were not directed at him. It was a statement of fact, as if she were speaking of something that had long been obvious to her. Jake froze. He couldn't understand what was happening, but the feeling of this absolute emptiness around him that emanated from Catherine overshadowed all his thoughts. In her presence, everything seemed false, even his own shadow, as if it was no longer a part of his essence. In her gaze, Jake felt his own boundaries blurring. "You say I'm creating this place, But you don't realize it already exists, she added, her voice solid as stone again. This place is you. You build it yourself so you wouldn't have to see what you'd created. Her words made no sense. He didn't understand what she was talking about, but the feeling of this place, which continued to exist despite his doubts, was so palpable that Jake began to lose confidence in his control over his reality at all. He took a step back, but the space around him changed. Suddenly the corridor disappeared, and he found himself in the same wasteland he had observed earlier. The entire world around him was destroyed, as if reality itself had been stripped of its foundations, as if someone had tried to tear him out of his usual coordinates, leaving only the feeling that he had never been a part of this reality. He looked back again, and saw her again, standing far away, among the dead remains. She seemed to be everywhere. Her figure dissolved into the air, becoming part of the space itself, as if she were its idea, its projection, its embodiment. You can't walk away from this, Jake. Her voice was heavy breathing now, as if the world were filled with her sounds. You've already walked this path, and now it leads nowhere. Why? Jake asked, but his voice sounded empty, as if he'd long since lost control of his words. Why am I here? Why can't I get out? Catherine took another step toward him. It was not a human step. It was a step of reality itself, deciding that Jake would move on. As she approached, his gaze caught not her face, but something beyond it. In her eye, which had turned as black as the universe itself, Jake suddenly realized that this was a perspective that was not human. It was the perspective of someone who transcended time and space. You're already dead, Jake. Her words were calm, but there was something inevitable about them. You just don't know it yet. Jake couldn't figure out what it meant. He couldn't figure out what the phrase meant, but everything he saw was becoming completely unclear now. There was a growing sense in his mind that everything around him was losing its meaning. The space around him was becoming alien, as if the air itself was changing, as if this was all part of a game in which he was just a piece on the chessboard rather than an active player. He wanted to shout, but his voice disappeared and everything became foggy again. You'll understand, she said, but her face was blurry again, as if his mind was trying to erase all traces of her existence. Everything will end someday, but you've been there before. And before Jake could respond, his world disappeared again. Jake found himself in that same place again. He couldn't understand whether this was a continuation of his journey or some kind of repetition. It was as if time had transported him back to the point where it all began, but now that point seemed even more distant and lost, like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream. The wasteland before him now had neither an edge nor a beginning. The ground, like black fabric, without flaws, without signs of life. Everything around was as dead as the moment when he first found himself here. He didn't know how much time had passed, but the feeling of a frozen world was becoming more and more distinct. There was no room for thoughts in his head, only sounds that were lost in the void, and words that could not find their meaning. Time did not move here. It hung like a motionless shadow. It was a place where he could not forget that he was not supposed to be here. But then the feeling of belonging consumed him, like reality itself. Suddenly a figure appeared before him. He knew it. It had always been there, but he couldn't figure out when it had appeared. You're back again, Catherine said, and her voice seemed as empty as everything around her. It evoked neither joy nor anxiety, only a feeling that this was neither the beginning nor the end, but an interval between two worlds. Jake couldn't answer. His lips didn't move, and when he tried to take a step, his body resisted, unable to move. Catherine stood before him, her gaze unchanging. It was the gaze of someone who had long since ceased to be a part of this world, a gaze that saw more than anyone else could understand. You think you can get out of here again, she said, her words echoing. But you've already chosen. You're here because you chose to be here. You've been in this place 1,000 times, and each time you think you missed something, but you noticed everything. Everything you've seen, everything you've experienced, it's all your reality. You created this world. No. I didn't create it, he answered, but his voice was empty, without strength. He himself did not believe these words. I can't understand it. And you shouldn't, Catherine said, not moving. It was as if she were not a person, but something more. You shouldn't understand everything, because you are just a part of the reality you have built yourself. You can't get out, because you create your own obstacles. Her words echoed in his mind, but Jake couldn't understand their true meaning. He tried to grab them, but they disappeared into a misty haze. It was like running in circles with no way out, but every step, every glance, reinforced the feeling that he was not alone, that this world was alive, that it was watching him, that he had been here before but couldn't quite comprehend it. You believe in your freedom, Jake, but you are not free. You cannot be free in the world you have built, Catherine continued, her words growing sharper. You are this world. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, a sense of control slipping. Everything was becoming unbearably strange, as if space and time were blurring. He tried to remember when it all began, when he had come to this camp, when he had met Catherine, but it all blurred, fading like frames cut from memory. He knew he was part of something vast, but he couldn't see it all. Do you want to take it all back? Catherine asked, her eyes so deep he couldn't take his eyes off them. You can, if you can, but you'll only remember what you want to remember, what you need to justify your choices. Jake felt his mind begin to race again, trying to find some kind of explanation for what was happening. Bits of thoughts, bits of memories flashed through his head. But something didn't add up. Something was wrong. He couldn't remember what. You've already made your choice, Jake, Catherine continued. You chose to be here. You chose to be a part of this, and now you can't leave. He saw her, but he didn't know if she was really there, or if her image was just another part of his mind trying to find a way out of this labyrinth. Her words merged with the world around him, became part of the void, and he became part of it. You don't understand, Jake said, increasingly unsure that he could even begin to comprehend what was happening. I didn't create this. I can't be a part of it. You can't not be, Catherine replied, her face suddenly as opaque as the universe itself. You built it all yourself, but you can't understand it until you're free of your own shackles. You can't get out until you're free of it. Jake froze, unsure of what to do. He tried to walk away, but his legs wouldn't move. He was stuck in this void. He tried to figure out what was happening to him, but his mind couldn't grasp any clear answers. He didn't know if this was his nightmare, his reality, or something else that he just couldn't understand. As he tried to take another step forward, the space around him began to change. It contracted and expanded, as if time itself couldn't figure out which way to move. His eyes saw distorted images, distorted figures, but Catherine remained where she was. She didn't move. She was part of that emptiness, part of that reality that was consuming him. At that moment, he realized that he couldn't leave. He couldn't go back. And maybe he'd never been in this world. It was a place that was only in his mind, and, strangely enough, it was there forever. You believe this is the end, Catherine said, her voice calmer, as if she already knew the answer. But this is not the end. This is the beginning. Everything around him began to fade again, as if reality was merging, disappearing, but Jake couldn't figure out where he was now, or what was really happening. Jake opened his eyes. Time, like place, was meaningless. He didn't know how much time had passed, and perhaps he didn't want to know. It was an emptiness in which everything was at once intimate and impossible. He couldn't remember how he'd gotten here. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was following some kind of trail he'd left for himself. But where were those trails? And, more importantly, where was he? He stood in the center of the room, huge, empty, but it felt like part of something bigger, some wider space. His gaze slid over the blurry outlines hanging in the air. The space was unnaturally stretched, the walls and ceiling floating in invisible, warped matter. The room was not part of any familiar world. Everything here was distorted, devoid of any earthly order. There was nothing like it in what Jake knew as reality. He could find no sign of familiar geometry. Catherine was still there, standing before him, but her face was as impartial and cold as before, looking at him with a profound stillness, as if her being could not be related to what he knew and felt. Where are we? He finally asked, not expecting an answer, but feeling that his silence might be even more threatening than his questions. Here, she said, her gaze unchanged, but something in her tone made him feel as if her words were not just information, but a warning. This was not a place that could be somewhere beyond his understanding. It was inside him. You know where we are, he continued, unable to escape this trap. We are where anything can be, she said. Her voice was almost metallic now, like sounds emerging from some unfamiliar harmony. We are here because you chose to be here. I didn't choose, he tried to object, but her words continued to consume him, wrapping around his consciousness like wild roots that he couldn't cut down. You've always chosen, Jake. You choose in every moment. And you can't get out of here, because you created this path. You built this road for yourself. He stepped forward, trying to understand what was happening. He felt his body leading him further into the void, but an inner voice resisted. It was more than just a feeling. It was an ominous premonition. He knew that not everything here could be what he saw. Catherine stood before him like a statue. He couldn't tell if she was real or part of something greater. She was like an element of this reality, like a reflection of it, creating the illusion of inevitability. You say it's my choice, but what if I didn't choose it? He finally said, feeling his words slip out before they could reflect the true anxiety. She just nodded, not making a sound. And though her gaze didn't change, her silence began to sound louder than her words. Jake felt something in that silence wrap around him, distorting his perception. He didn't know what was real. With each passing second, he lost more and more of the boundaries between himself and what was around him. He tried to find his way back, but every step only took him further. It felt like he couldn't go back, like this reality didn't allow for mistakes. Everything he saw seemed strange to him, as if it had existed before, in some other form, and was now falling apart like cracks in a fragile glass surface. You create this reality over and over again, Jake, Catherine said, her voice a little deeper now, like an echo returning from another world. You just don't see that you've always been here. Your attempt to escape it is another form of creation. He didn't know why her words hurt him so much, but she was right. He couldn't move away from her, from this place, from his own shadow that lurked behind his every step. Jake felt like he couldn't breathe. Everything seemed unreal, distant. He wanted to know the truth, but the feeling that the truth had always been with him, that he was a part of it, consumed him. You can't get out, Catherine said, not threateningly, but his fear was growing. You only think you want to get out. You don't realize that all your attempts are part of that very path. Jake tried to scream, but his voice was not heard. Instead of breaking the silence, it was absorbed by it. He realized that his consciousness had become part of this void, this endless machine of time and space that should not exist. But nevertheless, it existed because his mind had created it. He looked at Catherine, at her face, which was no longer just a face. It was more than a face. It was something his mind could not comprehend, something that was part of the same unknown force that kept him here, in this space. He couldn't get out. He couldn't go back. You don't want to know the truth, Catherine said, as if reading his mind. You're just not ready. And you never will be, because you already know everything. But you're looking for answers where there can't be any. You're creating your own questions to confuse yourself. Then he understood. There was a truth hidden in every word she said that he would never want to accept. That was the moment he realized that what was happening was not a mistake. It was not an accident. It was the result of his own decisions. All those layers, all those realities, all those endless paradoxes, it was him. He was trapped in his own labyrinth, built by himself. Catherine took a step back, her figure disappearing into the void like a shadow trail. She didn't disappear completely, she just dissolved, becoming part of this strange reality. Jake was left alone, standing in the same place, in the same room. Everything had disappeared, leaving only him and this endless world that was now not just around him, but inside him. Jake stood there, unable to move. His legs felt like stone, and the air around him felt thick, like a viscous liquid. He tried to remember where this reality began, but it was impossible. He couldn't pinpoint when he had arrived here. He couldn't remember what had brought him to this strange world, and most importantly, he couldn't understand why he had stayed. Every thought he tried to formulate vanished, as if reality simply wiped it away, leaving nothing to cling to. He tried to follow the tracks, but they disappeared, like sand that crumbles at the slightest touch. The hall he found himself in was empty and strange. The floor, ceiling, and walls seemed to be dissolved into one space, had no clear boundaries, and the structure itself defied any logic. His gaze could get stuck in some corner or perspective, but this did not bring relief. He could not understand whether the hall was round or square, or maybe it did not exist at all. He was not sure that he himself was standing on the ground, but at the same time he could not say that he was in the air. In his perception, there was nothing solid, no points of support. The figure appeared again. It was not Catherine, or perhaps it was. But her face was different, as if altered. It was not an exact copy, but rather her shadow, or her reflection in some distorted mirror. You still don't understand, the figure said, its voice sounding unnaturally deep, as if it was coming from the very core of the world. Did you think you'd get out of here? Jake couldn't answer. He tried to swallow, but the dry feeling in his throat prevented him from even making that simple gesture. His mind raced, but he couldn't find an answer to his own questions. Everything seemed false, but at the same time real. Was this a world he had created, or a world he was trapped in? His thoughts were once again floating in that strange, undefined space. Your mistake is that you keep looking for a way out, the figure continued. You were looking for it, trying to find the key, the way out of the labyrinth. But you have already actually passed it. You are already in the place you were looking for. You cannot get out because you are in it. You are the labyrinth. He tried to move again, but his body wouldn't obey. His fingers seemed to slide through the air, finding no support, as if reality were made of something elusive. He couldn't understand what was happening to him, but the desperation was growing. He knew that if he didn't start moving, if he didn't start searching, he might completely dissolve in this place, become a part of it. This is not your reality, Jake. This is a reality you cannot understand because you have built it. You try to escape it, but you are its center, the figure said. Jake felt his consciousness begin to give way. This world, or what he thought was the world, seemed increasingly fragile. He felt like the very fabric of reality around him was beginning to tremble, as if there was no present and no future. Everything was glued together by time gaps, and his thoughts were becoming too fast to catch. Something flashed before his eyes, but he couldn't quite place what it was. It was like a vision, blurry and distorted. You have spent too long trying to find your way, the figure spoke again, its voice slightly less threatening now, but its words nonetheless filled the space with an elusive anxiety. You were looking for a way out of the labyrinth, but it was not a labyrinth. You were always here. You were the labyrinth. And so Jake realized that he wasn't just trapped in this space. He was part of it, a living element that he had created without realizing it. He wasn't just wandering in this world, he was its creator and its prisoner. All his steps, all his movements, all his attempts to find a way out were just reflections of his own choices, choices he had made before he even knew what he was doing. He was trapped, and trapped he remained. The figure before him vanished, dissolving into thin air like mist, and Jake was alone again. But his loneliness was not the same as before. He already knew that it had been deceptive. He was not alone. He was part of something far more complex than he could have imagined. At that moment, he realized that his attempts to control what was happening were pointless. All his efforts to get out, to find a way out, to find the truth, were nothing more than cyclical steps leading to the same point. He was not just locked in, he was the essence of this vicious circle. Everything began to disappear. The emptiness shrank and then fell apart, but it did not disappear. It was inside him. He could not escape, because there was no way out, no beginning. He could try again and again, search for answers, search for the way. But each new search brought him back to the same moment. All he could do was continue to exist inside this vicious circle, hoping that someday he would be able to understand that his choices were not his choices, but a consequence of what he himself had already chosen. Then Catherine appeared before him again, but she was different. Her face was calm now, and there was no despair in her eyes. She simply stood there, looking at him, as if watching him lose himself, as if none of this mattered, as if it had already happened, and she was a part of it. The silence was as thick as ever. Jake felt a layer of it compressing around him, filling the space. It was everywhere, like air, only thicker, heavier. He could no longer tell where the silence began or ended. It did not allow him to move. Or, more accurately, it was his movement. He could not tell which was greater, his desire for understanding or the emptiness itself that prevented him. Catherine appeared before him again. She stood as still as before, her face devoid of any sign of emotion. But now her gaze was impenetrable, like glass, reflecting neither light nor shadow. Jake wanted to ask why she was still here, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she was part of this reality, but that didn't bring him relief. She wasn't an answer. She was a question that couldn't be delved into. "You're still looking for a way out," she said, her voice flat and cold, but without any threat or regret. "You can keep going, Jake. You can always keep going. It's your game, your choice." His breathing was ragged. He tried to understand what exactly she wanted to tell him. All he knew was that his attempts to leave, his search, were attempts to escape himself. But that was nothing new. He already knew that he could not escape this reality, could not leave the circle, could not leave. He was closed. "Why are you here?" he finally asked. It was a stupid question, but it kept coming out of his mouth, as if he couldn't figure out why he was asking it. Why was she always there, like a shadow? Why was she part of this endless void? Catherine looked at him, but did not answer. Only her gaze became even deeper, as if she was trying to convey something, but could not, or did not want to. The silence returned. It filled the entire space again, hiding all the answers, leaving only questions. It seemed that the very silence of her presence was the only reality that could be understood. Jake stood before her, trying to figure out what to do. He felt his mind slowly losing its shape, his thoughts floating in this strange space. Time was elusive. He didn't know how much had passed, how much would be, how much had been. It was all compressed, stretched out, and made no sense. "You think you're alone," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But you're not alone. You're here for a reason, Jake. You came here for a reason. You think you're not in control. You think you're just a piece in this game. But you're a player. You're not just a piece in the game. You're the creator of it. You play it, which means you are it." Jake suddenly felt his heart pounding. Something inside him snapped. He had been trying to hide from this thought for a long time, but it kept coming back like a ghost he couldn't escape. He was here. He had created this place. He couldn't understand how it was possible, but it was true. He was trapped in his own head, in his own reality. He wasn't just trapped here, he was its architect. Catherine was gone again, melting into the shadows. Jake couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything. He was trapped in that emptiness. He didn't try to get out anymore. He didn't know what he wanted. There was a subtle noise. A thin, almost invisible sound, like the rustle of wind through empty streets. Or maybe it was the sound of time itself, passing through his consciousness, tearing him apart. He began to think that everything that was happening to him was actually just his perception. He couldn't prove to himself that it was reality, because it wasn't. All he knew was that he was here. And he himself, perhaps, was the cause of what was happening around him. He realized that every detail of this world, even every thought he had, was created by him. He himself knew what was happening, but he could not control it. Everything he did, everything he experienced, was the result of his inner world, his own struggle with himself. The noise he heard was like an echo, going off into infinity. And each time it disappeared, it returned with a new question, a new illusion. Jake knew he couldn't get out, because he wasn't sure he wanted to get out. He didn't know if he was trapped, or if he was part of it, creating it from the inside. His gaze met emptiness again. And again he felt reality distorted. But this time he did not try to understand it. He accepted it. And in this acceptance there was no relief, no joy. It was simply existence. Understanding that you are not part of the world. You are this world. All you see is yourself. He stood there, absorbed in this feeling, and at some point he realized he would never leave here. He would never return. Because he was this place. He was what he was looking for. And he always would be. Jake felt his body slowly dissolving into space. At first it was a slight discomfort, as if he was shrinking to the size of his own thought. Then it grew into something heavier, as if his arms and legs were ceasing to exist, vanishing, and in their place were only internal images. Unreal. Lost. He couldn't believe that this was happening to him. Over and over again the thought came to him that all this was just someone's game, someone's whim. But every attempt to avoid this thought resulted in even more confusion. When his eyes scanned the space, it left no room for logic. Everything was too chaotic, too disjointed to understand what exactly was happening. Somewhere in that empty space, like echoes carried away by the wind, figures appeared. They remained for a moment and disappeared, leaving no trace, no memory of themselves. They became part of a mosaic that he could not assemble. Catherine appeared again, but her image was different. No longer sinister, but almost familiar. Almost family. With each glance from her, he felt his perception becoming more subtle, as if she were the very filter that hid the truth. The truth that he could not touch. "You want to know what's going on?" Her voice was barely audible, but there was a strange power in it, as if he could pass through her words, but could not break out of what they hid. Jake swallowed, trying to keep his thoughts in check. He wasn't sure what she was talking about, this world that surrounded him. It wasn't the normal world. It wasn't even his perception of the world. It was something deeper. I don't understand," he said, but his words sounded as unnatural as the space around him. He didn't know if he was speaking out loud or to himself. He didn't know where his reality was. Catherine came closer. She didn't walk, but rather her figure moved like a shadow, invisible and yet tangible. She wasn't part of this world. She was it. "This isn't just a world, Jake," she said quietly, but with such clarity that his heart sank. "This is a world you've made. You're surrounded by your own thoughts, your own fears, your own choices. You think you're alone, but you've always been here. You think you've lost something, but you haven't. You never lost anything. You held it all in your hands. He felt her words seeping into his consciousness. He tried to push them away, but they wouldn't go away. They were a part of him, like something buried deep, but always there. Images floated into his mind, memories that made no sense. He tried to remember where they came from, but every time he looked at the details, they faded into a haze. Time. It was like a dream in which he tried to escape, but could never find the door. He began to realize that time here, too, defied his understanding. It was not linear. It did not move forward, as in the world he had once lived in. It was closed, like his thought itself. It was part of this cycle that he had created. This isn't just a place, Jake, Catherine said. This is your prison, your world. You're the one in this cage, and you don't even know you're creating it. You're looking for an answer, but all the answers are already inside you. You are the answer. He felt her words begin to affect his perception again. He tried to understand what she meant, but it was so difficult, so hard, as if each question was tearing him apart. Every word, every look, every detail of this space became his own reflection. But I don't want this, he muttered. But he didn't know what it was he didn't want. Didn't want to stay here? Didn't want to understand? Didn't want to break this cycle? Or was all he really wanted something inexpressible? Catherine sighed, her gaze softening, but there was no regret in that gaze. She was not the one who could help him. She was the one who showed him that he had created this labyrinth in which he was lost. You can't get out of here, Jake, she said. This isn't just a trap. You walked into it yourself. You built it yourself. He couldn't say anything else. Every word that came out of his mouth became just part of that vicious circle that he couldn't break. He tried to run around this world like someone trying to find a way out of a labyrinth, but always returning to the starting point. All these efforts were in vain, because as soon as he began to realize that he was trying to break free, he increasingly understood that he couldn't leave. And didn't even want to. He couldn't figure out when it became part of his existence, when it became so familiar that it lost its meaning. This was his world, his created world, where every choice, every move, every word was his own. And there was no relief in that realization. There was only one inescapable understanding. There was no way out. He was stuck in this place because he was the cause of it. He was both the prisoner and the one who held the key to this cage. But this could not go on forever. For too long he had been trying to run through this labyrinth, not noticing that he himself was its prisoner. For too long he had been creating his own world, not realizing that it was he himself who had found himself at its center. When Catherine disappeared, the world around him became foggy again. He was alone, and again he felt the space shrinking. But now it didn't frighten him. Now he knew. He knew it was him. The silence hung over Jake again, like a heavy ceiling that seemed about to collapse. He stood in the center of nothingness, as if the entire world were wrapped in an invisible cocoon that could not be penetrated. Even his thoughts slid across the surface like shadows, vanishing without leaving a trace. He was more than an observer. He was part of this nothingness, part of this world, and at the same time nothing that could be felt or understood. Everything was too shaky, too uncertain, like a reality that teetered on the edge of sleep and awakening. Jake tried to piece himself together, tried to determine where his boundaries were, what existed beyond his perception, and what truly defined him. He tried to find that spark within himself that might show him the way, but it did not burn. All that remained was emptiness, heavy and dull. An emptiness that had no beginning and no end. He was trapped in its depths, unable to move, unable to go beyond. When Catherine appeared before him again, her image was slightly distorted. She stood as still as before, but now her gaze was different. It was not the gaze of a person, but the gaze of the world itself, with no goals, no motives, only cold objectivity. She did not try to explain anything. She did not try to comfort him. She simply was. And this made her presence even more unsettling. You didn't come here by chance, Jake, she said, her voice not as firm as before, but its coldness was the same. You created this world. You consumed yourself. He couldn't answer. The words he tried to say disappeared before they reached her, as if they didn't exist. He tried to step toward her, but his body was paralyzed. Not physically, but mentally. He couldn't act because he wasn't sure he existed. You don't understand what's happening, Catherine continued. You want to understand, but you can't. Because you yourself are not understanding. You yourself are what you don't realize. You are the result of your search. Her words were like a sentence. He felt something in his chest tighten, as if every word she spoke was a blow to his inner foundations. But he couldn't respond. He was stuck in a world that had no future and no past. He was stuck in a present that had become endless. You were searching, Jake, she added, without moving. You were looking for yourself in this world, but you did not find it. You became what you were looking for. You became this world. He became increasingly aware of how her words were drawing him in, how the very meaning of these words was beginning to penetrate his being. He could find no contradiction. He could find no foothold. He was part of this reality, and this reality was part of him. He had created it himself. But what should I do? He asked, his voice weak, almost inaudible. But there was no longer despair in his question. There was awareness. The awareness that there was no way out, no answers. Only the path he had chosen. Catherine didn't answer right away. She just looked at him silently. Her eyes deepened, as if they held an entire ocean, and Jake felt that ocean rolling over him, consuming every part of his being. You want to leave, but you can't, because you don't know what it means to leave, she said finally. You create your own problems so you don't have to face who you are. You are everything. You are this world. You can't get out because there is no way out. You hold yourself back. Her words sank into the void, leaving behind only an empty echo. Jake felt his inner world shrink again, his consciousness seeming to vanish, dissolving into thin air. He tried to focus, but his thoughts were as scattered as the space around him. He could find no point to latch onto. He was tormented by questions, but the answers were not coming. He was trapped, but the trap was not outside. It was inside him. Suddenly, everything around him began to change. Space began to warp, as if the air itself was becoming viscous and heavy, and then vanishing, dissolving into chaos. He felt his own consciousness begin to waver, as if his perceptions were somehow connected to this space, as if it were an extension of himself. And then he understood. He understood that all this was not just his perception. This was his world. He himself was its cause and its effect. He was its creator, its prisoner, and its victim. Everything that happened was the result of his own desires and fears. Catherine was gone, but her presence lingered in the air, like an invisible shadow. Jake no longer felt her as a separate entity. She was a part of him. She was a part of this world. He no longer tried to find a way out. He didn't want to understand. He simply accepted it. Accepted that he was what he saw. He wasn't just part of the world. He was the world. And in this acceptance there was no joy, no sadness. There was only the realization that there was no way out. No way. There was only this moment. This moment that was eternal because it was created by him. Everything froze. It was as if the breath of the world had been caught in a single moment, and space, time, his perception, all of it became one, inseparable. Jake stood in place, but his sensations did not belong to his body or his mind. He was not part of the world. He was the world. All this silence, this chaos, this unbroken chain of events, it was him. His eyes could no longer discern the difference between what was real and what was merely his illusion. He stood in a field of emptiness that existed only because he believed it existed. He was not merely present in that emptiness, he was it. He was everything that had once seemed real to him. He tried to remember where he had come from. But the memories did not cling. They were not important, were not needed. All that remained was the essence of being, the act of awareness itself. He tried again to break out of this perception, but felt that his own reality was too small to go beyond. He was locked in an endless loop, and he himself was the cause of it. You created yourself, Catherine's words echoed in his head. The words brought him back to the moment of realization. He felt the very structure of reality around him begin to crack. His perceptions became more and more diffuse, blurring, like rain falling on glass and running down it without leaving a trace. He suddenly realized that he was not just standing in the void, but was its center. This space did not exist without him, could not exist if he had not put his mind into it. He could move in this world, but each step he took brought him back to the point where he started. He could not find a way out, because there was no way out. He was that way out. Gradually, his thoughts began to disintegrate, and the world around him lost its clear boundaries. It was like a transition, like dissolving into something greater, but it was neither liberation nor destruction. It was something completely different, the perception of the world as a simple flow, in which time ceased to be linear. Everything around became permeated with this time, unsteady, fickle, but at the same time eternal. Suddenly a new figure appeared before him. This man was unlike any other he had seen. He didn't know his name, but there was something strangely familiar about his presence. This man was part of his world, but at the same time he seemed alien. He stood in front of him, motionless, like a stone sculpture, and looked at Jake, his gaze calm but piercing. He didn't say a word, but his presence was palpable, like a pressure on his consciousness. Jake didn't know who this man was, but he sensed that this wasn't just a figure standing before him. He was standing before a part of his own soul. Something he had tried to hide from himself, something he hadn't realized was there, but was always there. "You came here to find an answer," the man said, and his voice sounded like an echo of all the questions Jake had asked himself throughout his life. Jake began, but his words vanished into thin air, never reaching his own ears or the spaces alien to him. He didn't know what to say because he didn't know what to ask. The man standing before him seemed to sense his inner turmoil. His gaze did not judge or call for action. It was simply a presence that forced Jake to look at himself through the eyes of the world, through the eyes of his own mind. There was not only silence in that gaze, but also knowledge. A knowledge he could not comprehend because it was part of him. "The answers don't exist in what you're looking for," the man said. "You're trying to find them where there are no questions." Jake felt his inner self begin to dissolve again in this knowledge. He couldn't help but agree with these words. The answers he sought were already within him. But he couldn't find them because they had always been part of the reality he had created. You can't leave because you don't want to. You don't want to let go of this reality because you created it yourself, the man continued, but his words were not an accusation. They were simply a statement of fact. With every word, his reality became more abstract. He felt every memory, every thought of what had been before, disappear, become part of the world he had generated. This world was not just his mirror. It was his fruit, his aspiration, his fear. And then suddenly everything stopped. At some point, Jake realized that this world no longer existed as a physical reality. It had become something else, a moment where there was no time, no space, no form. Everything simply disappeared, like a dissolving mist. He wasn't here. He was nowhere. The man before him had disappeared, but even his disappearance did not leave a void. On the contrary, he had become part of what had disappeared. Everything was one. All these moments, all these experiences, all these images were parts of a whole that was neither beginning nor end. And there was no fear in this disappearance. It was not death or annihilation. It was something more. It was a release from everything. Jake realized that he had always been part of this universe, this void, and now that he had stopped searching, he was finally one with it. The world didn't need answers. All that was left was the space that had always been there. And he was that space. Everything stood still. Time, once solid, was now blurry and inexplicable. Things that had seemed important before no longer mattered. Jake had no idea how much time had passed, where he was, or what was happening to him. But standing in this void, with no horizon, no object to focus on, he suddenly felt his consciousness no longer bound by the search. He had stopped searching for answers because he realized there were no answers. It was not an empty confession. It was a release. He had let go of the chains that had kept him in this endless loop, in a world he had created, a world where there was no yesterday and no tomorrow, only a moment that would always remain the same. But this confession was not a triumph. On the contrary, it consumed him. He became part of what had always been, part of everything that was already around him. To be or not to be, it did not matter. He felt a presence again. In his mind, in his senses. But this time, this presence was different. It was not just a person, not just a figure. It was a symbol, an integral part of himself, his perception, his truth. "You're not standing here by chance," said a voice, familiar and alien at the same time. "You were on the edge. And you chose." But the choice was not his. He had become part of something greater than the choice. He was in this moment because he had always been with him. He could choose to continue on the path, but what would be on that path? He did not know, and it did not matter. The questions no longer made sense. The voice did not continue, but its presence remained. Jake did not see the figure, did not feel it directly, but he felt how it flowed into his consciousness, how its words became part of his thought, not trying to explain anything, but simply being. In this world where everything was possible and impossible at the same time, where every step led to a point where there was no space or time. Jake felt his body become weightless. It ceased to be important. It became just a sensation that passed through him, dissolving in each moment. He was himself, but he was not himself. He was a part of this world that could be and not be. It all depends on how you look at it. He felt no pain, no fear. He felt nothing but what he could call peace. But this peace was both terrifying and soothing. It was a peace that closed off all possibilities. It was a world where there was no choice. Only an emptiness that could not be otherwise. As soon as he realized this, he felt something change. His perception became focused again, but now he saw the world differently. He saw how every line, every stroke of this world connected with his thoughts, how his consciousness glided along these lines, as if he were not just an observer, but a conductor of existence itself. His thoughts were no longer lost in this space. They had become part of him, but now he was not afraid. He accepted it. He felt the space around him slowly begin to change, as if his inner world, his consciousness, were holding it all together, turning it into something bigger. He couldn't say what was happening, couldn't define what this process was, but he knew that he wasn't just a part of this world. He was this world. All his experiences, all his fears, doubts, and desires, all his choices, they were gone. They dissolved, becoming part of all of reality. He was a part of himself, a part of this single stream that moved through eternity, having neither beginning nor end. And so, as if by the will of this flow, everything that had seemed important faded into nothingness. He no longer had any sense of time or space or himself as a separate entity. Everything had merged into one, and in this one existence there was no pain or fear or joy. He was here and everywhere, and that was all that had ever mattered. This was not liberation. It was simply a continuation of what had come before and what would come after. It was the natural state of being, and in that moment, when all became one, a figure appeared before him. Not a person, not an entity, not a figure that could be characterized. It was something else. It was something greater than any perception that could ever exist in his consciousness. It was an unconditional knowledge that had no form. It was an answer that needed no questions. He realized that all of this was part of him, part of every step, every look, every doubt. He realized that he could not find an ending. He could not find an end, because there is no end. Everything always exists in one moment, in this eternal here and now. His consciousness could not leave this state, but there was no need. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. He had become part of the flow, part of reality, part of what had always been. He knew that everything he was looking for, everything he was trying to understand, was just a process, not a goal. The path was not separate from its end. It was a unity that ceased to be important. It was everything, and nothing more. Then, it disappeared.
More interesting thing to come. Be sure to watch the next video or check you the playlist. There you will find even more yourself and exciting. Thanks for the likes, comments and your support. It really helps to develop the channel.